pastors are often not given the tools or training on how do you build a community organization, because it's not easy.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, welcome back to Jesus in the Upper Left. I'm here with my co-host, Pete Armstrong. How you doing, Pete?
I'm doing well. Yeah, really well.
Yeah, It's been a good summer. And then we're here with Ben from Contingent.
Yeah.
It's been a little while since we've connected, I think once over coffee.
Yeah.
Probably 4 years ago.
It has been a while. Yeah. It's good to see you.
Yeah. Tell us, for folks that aren't familiar with your work and Contingent, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the Contingent started in 2008. Portland, as you guys have no doubt discussed on this podcast, had a very fascinating kind of resurgence moment in 2008 when the Louis Palau Association did a festival here in Portland. And I was one of a few leaders that ended up taking the dare in that moment and starting new nonprofit organizations. Cool. So there's a remnant of us left for sure from that time. And we originally started as the Portland Leadership Foundation. And we were heavily involved in working with churches here in the Portland metro area and started expanding across the state. And we've now are a national organization. So it turns out when you go to, I don't know, Burns, Oregon, or Little Rock, Arkansas, that people don't want to talk to anybody from Portland these days, in some ways. And so we rebranded as the Contingent in 2020.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
And then how did you, so it sounds like, was there like an altar call or something, like come start like a kingdom-focused non-profit, or what was it that prepared you for that moment to say, hey, here am I?
What I would say is I think there was a convergence of factors of things both going on in my own kind of personal sense of calling, but certainly there was a milieu in Portland at that time that was really unique. I moved to Portland in 2003 to originally work for Young Life and ran Young Life on the east side. And early on in those days, we started a scholarship program called the Act 6 Scholarship. And there was always this kind of yearning to be more of a social entrepreneur in terms of going out and trying some new things. But I think what gave me a sense of confidence to go do that in 2008 was this recognition that the body of Christ was standing up in Portland, and not in opposition of the other, but to serve the other. That was an inspiring time. And so there were networks of leaders that were having big dream discussions about, how can we create the right, if you will, wineskins to hold the new wine. And there's many organizations, the Compassion Connect started in the same window. The Refugee Care Collective was an outpouring of that. And certainly our organization was one as well. So it wasn't an altar call, but it was definitely kind of a wind of energy that for, faith-based entrepreneurs, it was like, let's ride it. So we did. Yeah.
Nice. So you probably have these coffee meetings, and I mean, we kind of had one. But when like a faith leader, a nonprofit leader comes to Portland, now that you've been here a long time, like what do you tell them about the context?
So it's been fascinating, and this is my convictions on this have increased even more as most of my time now is traveling to other parts of the country. I get a lot of questions about Portland. It always starts with this question of like, especially from places outside of Portland, like, are there even Christians in Portland? Like, how many is there? Like 7 of you? Like, how many? And, so what I always, share if folks are interested in my perspective is that Portland is an incredible place to follow Jesus because it is a post-Christian culture, but the people who are trying to live out their faith in the public square are doing so having made a calculation as to what that actually looks like, recognizing that there is not a prevailing wind, and so you have to be able to translate your faith in a context that has largely come to a conclusion that the message of Christianity is not one that is part of the power of the city. The power of the city, the power structure, the the question of like who's elected, who's in office, who runs these businesses, philanthropy, et cetera. There's just not a really broad network of people of faith, in those positions, although there are. And so what that does is I think it allows actually for you to, from my perspective as a leader coming to Portland, who's a person of faith, it allows you to actually occupy your space instead of having to occupy others. And that I think is a really good opportunity for innovation. I think it's a good opportunity for ingenuity and for people that want to be creative in their expression. For me, it was running a nonprofit organization in terms of my professional life. Anyway. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here. It just is, it's not on the surface in the same way.
The way another one of our guests put it was like, in other areas of the country, she was like, a real estate agent goes to church and you're like, yeah, you're there to worship, but you're also there to find customers and to make, like I'm here and I'm a part of this community and I'm going to meet a lot of people and you just wouldn't really do that.
Because I think sometimes I wonder too, in the way that it's less of an economy, to your point. Because I think when we interact with one another, we're already exhausted by the outside pressures of trying to make it work in a post-Christian environment. That like we're less interested in some sort of binary exchange with one another.
I think we should chat for a few minutes about like being followers of Jesus in a post-Christian context, because I think that's really interesting. I think people that listen need to hear a little bit about that. Something that was formative for me was 2 years ago. I was in Greece serving refugees there. And the ministry in Athens drew Christians from England, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, and from America. And oh my gosh, it's really refreshing, especially to see to work around young leaders, like a 25-year-old that is passionate about following Jesus and like welcoming the stranger, welcoming the refugee, which maybe you don't always find here. It really encouraged me for what it means to be a follower of Jesus, like in post-Christian context of like, there is so much life and goodness and common grace and all these things that are happening. And sometimes that gets overly politicized in the US. Sometimes you just don't associate those things together, but I'm like hopeful.
I agree.
I know you're a hopeful person.
I agree. I feel an incredible sense of verve living in this city. And it's an odd city in the sense that I do think it attracts people that are asking that question of how do I translate the gifts that God's given me with the message of the gospel into culture in a way that culture can hear it. And if you can pull it off in Portland, you could pull it off in some other ways. Now, I'm not suggesting that Portland should be exporting what Portland is by any means. I think it's more just this question of why is it that Portland has such a unique cadre of people that have been able to almost rise onto the national stage of what you might expect like Christian culture to look like out of Portland. Why is that? And I think my conclusion is that you don't take anything for granted here, and you have to deconstruct and reconstruct in a way that is on the edge. And as someone that doesn't mind the edge, that's exciting.
I also see, I think a fruit of that non-Christian setting here is the unity that has to grow. Like in other places where it's Bible Belt and church culture, it's really easy to emphasize all your differences and to bicker about that. And well, this church has this church has this. But when you're like, dude, okay, Jesus, okay, we got that in common. We don't have to pretend there's not differences in other areas, but they just they go down the priority list because you're like, wow, if there's just someone else that is alive and breathes and confesses Christ, I want to work with them.
Yeah, and well, you model that better than anyone, Oshawa, when you looked at how you inherited this opportunity to actually make an investment in that. And I just want to thank you for that, because I do think it takes leaders like you and like you, Pete, that are able to create that wavelength that people like me and so many others are riding on. Because I agree that the unity is also a really unique aspect. I spend a lot of time now in the South because we have grown to some of our work has grown in the South. And man, it's been a culture shock for me, not because there's so many Christians, but because of some of the competitive spirit. Yeah, it's been a challenge to overcome.
Yeah. So you're going to these, you're going to Arkansas, you're going to Grand Rapids, Michigan, you're going to these places to talk about foster care, or tell us more about that.
Yeah. So, I've often described what has been happening in Portland, and I tell this story a lot across the country. I think Portland is a beacon of light for so much of what is possible. And when our organization was kind of turning our attention to what is possible, we in 2012 started an initiative called Every Child Oregon.
Yep.
And Every Child it started with a group of faith communities, actually 4 faith communities in Portland that adopted their local child welfare office, and 4 turned into 17, and 17 turned into 34, and a stream turned into a river, and the river turned into a flood.
Yeah.
And out of the gate, without a logo or a website or anything, and the Oregonian wrote an article in January of 2013. So this is a revolution in Portland's foster care, faith communities, adopting local child welfare offices and foster parents coming forward. And what happened is we began to not only see that effort grow here in Portland, but across the state of Oregon. And so in 2020, right before the pandemic, the federal government came to Portland, and it was a fascinating visit, actually, covered in the Oregonian. If you Google "Feds Celebrate Oregon's Every Child," the Trump administration sent someone from the White House to Oregon to spend a day with Governor Brown.
Okay.
And we embedded an Oregonian reporter on that visit. And it was a fascinating time because, there's a lot of conflict. It was, a lot of tension, a lot of polarization, and 2 people that should be on the opposite sides of the aisle spent a day together. And the premise of it was, walking away, was the Trump administration and the assistant secretary for the Administration for Children and Families being quoted in the Oregonian saying, like, what's happening in Portland and in Oregon should be cloned and exported to all 50 states in the country. And so the COVID hit, and long story short, coming out of COVID, we have had an overwhelming amount of interest to launch our Every Child initiative across other states. So we have taken over the responsibility for foster family recruitment for the entire state of Oregon, but also for the entire state of Arkansas, the state of Indiana, the state of Tennessee, and we have got 11 states that are in the queue asking us to work with them. And it all started with the unity of 4 faith communities in Portland, that said, like, let's do this thing. So we've tried to organize it in a way that is encouraging, faith communities across the United States, but also governments to think a little outside the box. I won't overtalk it, but what I just would say is foster care is an interesting challenge because these are kids that are experiencing abuse and neglect. They're being removed from their parents in a neighborhood. And far too often, because we don't have enough foster parents, kids are being ripped from their schools and their social networks and being placed and scattered all over the place. And so when you look at the irreducible prime of what the solution is, it's healthy families. It's not a government program. And the government has assumed the responsibility for caring for these vulnerable children. They carry all the liability, but they have struggled because they've lost trust in many places with community members. And so you need an intermediary to step in and call the community to more. And the faith community is a really good source to do that work. Certainly we work with all kinds of organizations. It's not just churches, but the faith community really has been a stalwart in that space. So it's been encouraging.
So what are the solutions that the faith communities are offering? Is it more upstream from the foster care system, so family health, or is it kind of rescuing the kids out of the system, bringing them into intact Christian homes? Like, what are the steps you guys are taking?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're about to launch Every Child in Tennessee later here. This is being recorded in August. So the Governor Lee has asked for 10,000 churches in the state of Tennessee to get involved in the child welfare space. And the child welfare space is very broad as a definition. We want to do anything that we can to get opportunities for community members to be involved. Our message is we need more foster parents, but not everybody should be a foster parent. You know, as a foster parent, and I've often described it as like throwing your life off a cliff. Like it's super, super hard. And so not everybody should do that, but everybody can do something. So what we've done is we've created this engagement continuum where a community member always has an opportunity for involvement, and we facilitate those opportunities for engagement. Some of those are upstream. Some of those are doing prevention work, helping families that are in crisis so that their kids aren't removed. Some of them, unfortunately, some families do have to have a temporary moment where kids are removed. And then it's this question of how do you wrap around that family while they're working on reunification? What are the kinds of volunteer opportunities that we can provide, tangible goods that we can, tangible needs that we can meet? And then certainly we just need more foster parents. And so it's a real issue across the United States. For the last 5 years, the number of foster families has been in decline. So this is not a situation where the faith community's figured it out and there's not a need. I would go as far as to say our country has a real crisis, actually. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of states are interested in learning from what we've done here in Oregon.
So more broadly, obviously that's one large part about transformation. So we thought, if we get this time together, what's something that really the Venn diagrams of the way that we spend our vocational life, I am working and, joining the Holy Spirit in personal and societal transformation in East Portland. That's I plan to do that until I die. This is my calling, my commitment, my context. And we're all doing that in these various places. And we've seen it multiply and grow and everything. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's agitate that problem a little bit. What other issues do you feel like are facing our city, in that you dream would be changed?
I think, I might approach this maybe at a meta level that I'll start there. And I don't know if it'll be helpful for listeners, but I guess what I would say is I think from my perspective, when you look at Portland, it's a libertarian town.
And it's not a liberal town. People are no, leave us alone.
That's right. Yeah, leave us alone. And yet we have big government. We're overtaxed in so many ways that's just my perspective anyway, and so we have this exacerbated problem in our city where we have invested in big government, but oftentimes when looking at the most vexing issues, whether that's the homelessness or housing issue or the opioid epidemic or even, how we engage with crime, certainly I would throw the foster care issue in there. I would look at our school systems and how they're functioning. Some of what we've realized, I think, is that by entrusting government with our resources, and that on the one hand is it being a good steward in community, but it also in a libertarian environment can be a very dangerous line of abdicating responsibility. And so I think the biggest challenge that our city faces is that libertarian spirit, if you will, far too often says that is yours to solve. It is not mine to solve. And so,
ownership.
That's right. So our organization has been obsessed around this idea of mobilizing community. To say, you can't abdicate your responsibility to the government and then just take shots and wish it was better. And even as a person of faith, I think this question of how do the ethics of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus inform how you live? And they are so radical in the service of others. They're so radical in taking action. They're so radical in laying down your life as a very visceral, I don't think Jesus was using that as a metaphor. I think he's dead serious about it. And so the question of how do we get community members to live into those ethics when the cultural norm is more of a libertarian norm. And I think that is the single biggest crisis our city faces.
Why does the Contingent do what it does specifically?
It all comes down to, from our perspective, we are recognizing and perceive there to be some battle lines that have been drawn in our culture. And we have two big strategies of how we're wanting to go about that. So I would say the battle lines are, I think we have an ongoing, and we'll continue to have an ongoing challenge in the conversation around race. I think this idea of the wealth gap, I think, is a real challenge. I think the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. And I think that that's going to create cultural unrest. And then I think that you can look at some of the political divisiveness in terms of ideology. And ultimately, our organization is informed by certainly the teachings of Jesus in a way that says, if we were to build an organization that could attempt to build infrastructure, if those battle lines that are drawn become more fomented and we see increased division, like what will hold us together at that point? And so our mission is that we exist to empower leaders and mobilize community. Those are the two things that we think will hold us together. Not that the contingent is the answer to Portland's problems by any means, but more just this question of like, if an organization could commit to those two things, my perspective is we will need that. So I'll just give you one quick example. So as you all know, Portland's a pretty white town, but it's increasingly getting more and more diverse. I mean, Peter, you live in East Portland. You're seeing that every day.
Yeah.
And this is the neighborhood. And certainly, so do you, Oshawa. You see it.
Down the street.
Yeah. And so the census projects that in 2043, the majority of kids born will be kids of color. And that's a national figure.
Yeah.
And when you look at the people that are in power and you look at the people who have resources, the people who have authority, the
people who are going to be giving their kids and grandkids wealth.
That's exactly right. And you then imagine and you ask yourself the question: if representation matters, if the people in leadership reflecting you is what our democracy is built on, and we know that is where the population is going to go, which is just one of these multiple battle lines. What would you do today if you thought it was worthwhile that those kids saw the leadership of the community reflect the population? And we're just so far removed from that becoming a reality. And so we're trying to set some arc, for a long-term goal. So that's one of the dates we look at. Our board looks at 2043, like what would have to occur, and you start, if you think sci-fi, it adjusts how you make business decisions.
Yeah.
So how do you think through it sounds like you have an entrepreneurial spirit, you're looking out at the landscape, you're seeing the complex challenges that are facing the community, you're looking at your opportunities and you're pulling the trigger on certain things, certain initiatives. How do you discern through that process, both of like, this is an issue that we can address, that we can mobilize towards? So that's kind of the foundational question. But then how do you, I'm sure you're familiar with the book When Helping Hurts, right? And as I look on in the Portland landscape, I have mixed feelings about the nonprofit sector.
Sure, yeah.
Just to say it nicely. And so how do you say, yes, we can address this issue, let's mobilize resources and people to that, and then here's the framework so that we make sure we don't cause more harm than good?
Yeah, a great question. So it's actually that very question, I think, that has propelled a lot of where our organization has gone over the last 5 to 10 years. So we have a lab internal to the organization we call the Action Lab, and it's designed to, it's a 5-step process that is designed to ask, how do you co-design solutions to problems with the people that are being impacted by that, people with lived experience? And what is a methodology that we can use if we're going to put ideas into the lab that may or may not turn into nonprofit initiatives? How do you walk through a methodical process to do that? And I'm happy. It's probably a little wonky. I'm happy to walk through it if it's of interest to you or the listeners. But I would say it's a very methodical 5-step process. There's a lot of check and balances to it. And I think what ends up happening far too often in the nonprofit sector, and the contingent, by the way, has been guilty of this. So I am not taking some sort of high ground. But I think far too often what happens is you have someone with really good intentions, and those good intentions oftentimes are in some sort of a vacuum, and they just start doing good work, and because they have this big of feeling. but they oftentimes are not talking to people with lived experience. They're oftentimes not thinking through collaborative, more horizontal relationships and interacting with people that maybe already be in the space. So you see redundancy, and then you see a lot of organizations that like have, small to mid-sized budgets that are all kind of doing similar things, and it creates inefficiencies. And
I would argue if you have an entirely secular worldview and you don't understand human incentives and even like the issue of original sin and some aspects of human psychology, I think there's a lot of enablement that goes on.
Sure, yeah.
That you actually have to like rewire some of the like foundational software in these views of humanity to try to say, what is flourishing? Let's define what is flourishing.
Yeah.
What is the actual problem? What's upstream from the availability of drugs? Is there something else above that we can address? Like, I feel like there's some like hard-coded issues that you don't have to be Christian, but at least have, I would say, a realistic view of human nature. I
don't disagree with that. And so what I'm about to say is not to contradict what you said, but maybe just to accentuate the problem. And that is, I think what you're describing is really ideal, but it is not how the funding works. So to me, what you have in the nonprofit industry is an addiction to it. The industry is addicted itself. It's addicted to government money. It's addicted to a method of extracting resources from other philanthropic sources. And those entities themselves are not asking the question you're asking. So then it's one of those things you can get into it with your organizing principle, which I think is spot on. But the likelihood that you actually scale to the point of impact is so low. Because of the funding model.
But
and anyway.
There are beautiful things happening in that space, though. 10 years ago at this time, Scott Harrison from Charity Water, he and I would get together every Thursday morning and study the Bible together with 10 other guys in New York City.
Dude, we got to talk about that because I'm getting in contact with him.
Great. And he's living in Tennessee now and everything. But here's the thing: when he explained to me, I hope to reframe not just the water crisis, but the charity, basically the nonprofit space. That was mind blowing for me. Because it's exactly, he's identified this. So people like you and Scott are reframing it, reorganizing it like the tech world has done in so many ways. We have to totally rethink charity because we've done it wrong. We forgot what it's about. We're addicted to the cycle, and and you're compelling people to give for the wrong reasons. You're all these things. So I think it's just real. And of course, me thinking it through the lens of a pastor and the way that we because we raise money for our organization.
Sure. Yeah. You're running a business.
And we've done so many of the same things.
Yeah. I think that's where it's a sleight of hand, because I don't want to be intellectually dishonest to say that we are also needing to raise money in order to make ends meet, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think that's, from our organization's perspective, is it all started with this, and I'll go back to 2008. This question was, how do you get the people of the church to sweat and bleed and interact and be relational in the community, And I think that's why, we've gone all in on not hiring a bunch of staff as caseworkers and to be nonprofit professional employees to solve the problem. But our premise is that the community should be mobilized to get involved. And that, I think, is also a challenge the sector has, is that oftentimes the resources are to professionalize service, as opposed to recognize that maybe service actually is something that should be inculcated into the human desire and structure for how we derive meaning. And so we need to get people, I think, a little bit more active is our
well, and that goes back to what you were saying about the libertarian thing too, because I think that people, and we see it in the church too, probably in the churches that we've all been in, there's folks that are just I will write a check for that. And it's it might be easy for them to write a check. And that is kind of that's my service. That's my thing. But really, you miss out on so much when you do that. And we see that, we see that in the church, we see that in the culture, we see that in the nonprofit sphere of like this, I will professionalize that. I will pay for you to hire somebody to disciple my kids so that I don't have to learn how to do it.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay. So we've stirred up a little bit of that challenge, and I would say some perverse incentives, right? that you're talking about within the nonprofit space and the funding there. But from a different angle, more of a community kind of grassroots level, I think it's a really great model from Mark DeMaz, right? One of the founders of the multi-ethnic church movement. And some of his recent work, he talks about these, like the three legs of this stool of church, faith community, where you're focused on proclaiming the gospel, like business as mission, and like other revenue streams that come from adding actual value into the community, diversifying beyond. So a church having business revenue in other ways, so you diversify beyond just needing to be supported, which then can lead to, well, let's minister to the middle class and the wealthy because they're the ones that can actually support our ministry. But then he talks about the third leg of the stool being starting community organizations and the value of starting nonprofits to have community impact. And one just illustration he gives is like, so you start the food pantry. If it's under your church and it's just, hi, I'm Pete from Christian Reformed Church. Will you give to my food pantry? We're doing this thing. And you go to other churches to do that. They're going to say, well, no, that we don't give to other churches. But if you start another food pantry outside of your church, you still have some leadership involved in it, but it's a community organization. Then all of a sudden you can network with all the churches in the area.
The school next door came to me, last year and said, hey, can we host the food bank here every Friday? So that's awesome. We let them use our restrooms, and a few people from our church volunteer, but it's basically like, I love that. I mean, it works. It works on so many levels, to build relationships in the community, and
So, what good models or good examples do you see of churches engaging, or even just like the Refugee Care Collective story of just an activated member saying, "I want to help fix this issue," and going and doing it? Where do you see some good examples and models for that?
That's a great question. So, spent some time on this a little bit. The Action Lab that I mentioned earlier, over the last 5 years or so, I've worked with 40 different churches, some in Oregon and some in other parts of the country. And I'm actually, just as a little plug, I'm working right now with Portland Seminary on a new master's program, a master's in community leadership, with this basic question in mind. And the premise of it would be, how do you get faith leaders to ask the community question around what does it mean to be essential in the community? And I agree with the conviction that far too often, if you don't have I'll say a portfolio in the way that you described it of your church and also potentially a business side and then also a community organization opportunity, you're going to leave opportunity on the table for engagement because of people's, especially in Portland, I think they can't quite wrap their mind around a church. And I also would just say that the sustainability of the funding is also going to be a challenge. All that to say, we've been working with churches to start community organizations, about 40 of them over the last 5 years. And so I can give you a couple examples of those. But there's a really cool effort in Flint, Michigan right now called Good Laundry, where the church had a building and that was connected near the church. And they decided to turn it into a discounted laundromat for the people of Flint. And so they had to start their own 501c3 organization in order to get the donations that they wanted to not, if you will, to diversify their revenue, to not compromise the church. And so, if you Google them, you'll see, it's just been widely covered in Flint of what this church has done as this organization to be able to offer free or discounted laundry service for the people of Flint. That's a good example. I think there are many examples of that, but ultimately where I see the gap, and this is just more from my nerd perspective, is pastors are often not given the tools or training on how do you build a community organization, because it's not easy. And so you can get an idea, but how you create something that's sustainable, because the challenge, of course, is that if you're going to say to the community, this is an expression of what it means for the church to be essential in your neighborhood, then sustainability matters, as opposed to flash in the pan. stuff. So I think the biggest challenges generally are around sustainability.
Yeah. Somebody 20 years ago said like the rubric of the church is if you left, would the neighborhood miss you?
Yeah.
So it's essentially that kind of question. But it takes a long time for when I think of some of our older members or people that have been, in our church or in our denomination for 70, 80, 90 years to like think about that, because it's just like, no, we've been here, we will be here. Like this church has been here for 65 years.
Yeah,
that doesn't mean it will be here in 65 or even 6. Like if we're not like intentional and thoughtful about what we're doing.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So if a church or a pastor said, hey, we would love to get involved in that. We would love to we see an issue in our community. We want to know how to address it better, start a community organization. What either advice would you have, or what pathways do you guys have with your lab to do that?
Yeah. So, I'd be happy to meet with any listener in terms of giving them kind of an overview of how we go about it. Certainly it's very in depth and it takes time and energy and resources and all of that even to walk through it. But there's really 5 steps to it that I would offer any pastor or anybody that is either listening or watching the podcast. And that is, our 5 steps are, you start with an inspiration and a conviction. Generally, we're pretty good on that. We can get the inspiration and the conviction started. But what's really important is creating a problem statement that accurately defines the problem. And then you have to write a concept paper. So we have a method for how we write concept papers that then need to go through scrutiny and need to go through a co-design process. So that's when you need to meet with people with lived experience and people in the community, other stakeholders, and get feedback on that. We call that the validation phase. And then after the validation phase, you go into what we call the demonstration phase. And then if you can, the 5th stage is scale. Each of those phases has dozens of artifacts from how do you budget? How do you fundraise? How do you create a business model?
Yeah.
What's your theory of change? How do you evaluate results? There's just a lot that goes into it. What I would encourage anyone to do is to say, if you want to reach out, I'm happy to share with you that overview. But ultimately, the rigor that you exercise in the ideation and concept development process, and the deeper you go, the more impact you will have. And if you take shortcuts on those stages, you take shortcuts on getting validation, you take shortcuts on the co-design, the likelihood of failure dramatically increases.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds very similar to like a human-centered design.
Yeah. We have staff that's all they do is co-design, human-centered design work.
Yeah.
So how can I feel like we've talked about this already, which is good. We're never sure how the conversation is going to go, but how can the church connect more with the contingent? How can the church be part of the solution, like in our city?
Yeah. What I would say is the good news is that leaders like yourselves and so many others that I admire in this town, have built, I think, really a beautiful structure with Together PDX, where there is a Serve PDX effort, and the organizations that have kind of been vetted, through Serve PDX are equipped to be able to engage with you. And so I want to offer that broadly. Because certainly our organization and our Every Child Organ effort is one of those organizations, but there are multiple. So if you have any starting point questions, I would just go to the Serve PDX at the Together PDX website and reach out to those organizations. We have absolutely kind of mastered the art of how do you get a church involved in the child welfare space. And so we have many different ways and examples, lots of different templates that can get someone who's elderly involved all the way down to a family that might be a foster parent. And so, if you're interested in the child welfare space in the Portland metro area, I'd love to connect to you and get your congregation involved immediately. This isn't like a year from now. We could do it next week. So, and I just think there are some great organizations that are on that list. So I can't speak on how all of the other efforts with Together PDX connect directly to congregational life. But that would be my starting point.
Yeah. Huh.
Cool. Well, my last question would just be, what gives you hope as you look out at Portland and there's like a lot of black pills, a lot of like hopelessness that is there? people kind of just say, hey, that's it. I'm tapping out. I'm leaving. So what hope, like what keeps you in this city, serving this city? Because you can go national now, right? You can relocate to
Washington,
Phoenix
DC.
or Austin or whatever. What keeps you here and what gives you hope as you look ahead?
Yeah. I think that there's a moment that we're in where there are positive signs regarding how the city government is being restructured. I think that there are positive signs regarding a more kind of pendulum swing back to a more moderate position on some of the things. I mean, if you just look at, the chief of police in Portland, Bob Day, who's a friend of mine, who's a follower of Jesus, and he's just, I would just say, like, we've come a long way even in leadership within the police bureau. And it's not going to be overnight. We dug ourselves into a big hole. And we're digging out, but I do feel like we are digging out. And so there are so many geographical benefits to living in Portland in terms of its beauty and its proximity to adventure and all of that. And the city, I think, needs to go through an examination period, and then maybe has, I hope, to acknowledge the folly of what we attempted to do in the way that we organize ourselves. And so we imploded for a while, and people always ask me, I say I live in Portland, and I'll die in Portland. I'm not going anywhere. They all think the city is still on fire. I mean, Trump was in a rally, whatever, the other day in Michigan or where, I don't know, talking about Portland, and Portland is a metaphor for brokenness and for violence and for all of those things. And, I just don't see Portland that way. I don't see it as a battleground. I see it as a playground. I'm inspired by the work that you guys are doing and so many others. And I think we're going to have a decade of digging out from a 5-year window of digging deep in terms of the hole we dug. But I have a tremendous amount of optimism. I'll just give one more example. A good friend of mine, Vince Jones Dixon. You guys might know Vince. He was city commissioner in the city of Gresham and just ran for Multnomah County commissioner. Vince is an African-American man whose brother was shot and killed in Portland and decided he wanted to get into public policy. Vince is a follower of Jesus. He's dead serious about that. He carries a more moderate position, which makes it almost impossible to get elected. But the people of Multnomah County elected Vince. And that would not have happened 3 to 5 years ago. But it just happened. And so, I see signs like people like Vince that are able to step in and lead. And I think maybe, I don't know, one of you guys should run for office. But I guess I see the structure snapping back a little bit from the chaos. So that's my hope.
Hey,
praise God.
Yeah. It's wonderful to end on a note of hope and to carry that with us into the work that we do. And we hope that it's been an encouragement and a challenge to everyone. And continue to track with what you're doing. And I would just encourage everybody to check out the Contingent online and you and your team. Fantastic team that we do a lot of stuff with on the ground level. But check out what's going on through there. And thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.